My grandmother told me what happened on the night my mother was born on a Tuesday evening in October, in a hospice room in Plattsburgh, New York, with the maple outside the window turning the same color it had turned every fall for almost 90 years. She was 89. The nurse had just finished her rounds. My grandfather had been dead for 11 years. My mother had been dead for 3. The two of us were alone in that room the way we had been alone in her kitchen 1,000 times when I was a boy, and she waved me closer with a hand that still worked, and she told me a story she had never told another living soul. "Stanley," she said, "come here, honey. I need to tell you something." I pulled the chair up to the bed. I am 45 years old and a grown man, but when Nora Haskell said she needed to tell me something, I came like I was 8 years old and sitting on the step of her kitchen in Tupper Lake, New York, waiting for a slice of molasses bread. She looked at the ceiling for a while. Her breathing was shallow, and she had to time her words to the spaces between breaths. "The Bigfoot in the hollow," she said, "carried your mother home the night she was born." I waited for her to laugh, or to take it back, or to tell me she was mixed up on her medication. She didn't. She turned her head on the pillow and looked straight at me, and her eyes were clearer than they had been in a month. "I never told anybody," she said. "Not your grandfather, not your mother, not the priest, not one living soul. I've been ready to tell somebody for a while now. It's your turn to carry it, honey. You're the one who ought to know. My name is Stanley Haskell. I have worked 22 years for the State Highway Department, most of it pushing a snowplow through winters that killed more men than people talk about. And when you do that job long enough, you learn to tell the difference between what you saw and what you think you saw. My grandmother knew that about me. That is why she chose me to tell. I believed her. She did not embellish. If she said a thing happened, it happened. It was the 3rd of February, 1956. My grandmother was 21 years old, 8 months pregnant with my mother, and married to my grandfather, Lloyd Haskell, who was 26 and working that winter on a pulp crew at a lumber camp in the country west of Cranberry Lake, about 40 miles of bad road from where they lived. The road conditions between Tupper Lake and that camp in February of 1956 were not what you would call reliable. My grandfather came home every other weekend when he could, and when he couldn't, my grandmother managed alone in the little farmhouse they were renting from an old man named Otis Tolbert, which sat at the end of a dirt lane 2 miles off the main road, surrounded on 3 sides by spruce and balsam fir and a 4th side that opened onto a meadow and then onto more trees. There were no neighbors within a mile. There was a wood-fired cook stove, a kerosene lamp, a hand pump in the kitchen, and a party line telephone that worked about half the time in good weather and almost never in a storm. On the morning of February 3rd, she drove the old Ford truck into Tupper Lake to pick up some groceries and a refill of iron pills that the doctor in Saranac Lake had prescribed on account of the pregnancy. The truck was a 1949 half-ton with a heater that worked if you babied it and tires that were bald enough that my grandfather had been saying he'd replace them as soon as he got paid. She made it into town, got her groceries at Shaheen's on Park Street, picked up the pills at the drugstore, and started for home just after 2 in the afternoon. The snow started about halfway back. At first it was nothing, just flurries, quiet Adirondack snow that sifts down when the wind shifts north and doesn't seem to mean anything. By the time she turned off Route 3 onto the road that led home, it was coming harder. By the time she reached the turnoff for the Tolbert Lane, the wipers couldn't keep up, and the truck was fishtailing on the fresh snow over the old ice. She made it a half-mile up the lane. Then the truck slid off the road. It was not a serious slide, not in the way that people sometimes mean when they talk about going off the road in the North Country. The truck went into a shallow ditch on the right-hand side and tilted about 20 degrees. The engine stalled. She could not get it started again. She sat there for maybe 10 minutes, pumping the gas and turning the key and listening to the starter grind. And then she gave up, and she started thinking about what she was going to do. She was 1.5 miles from the house. It was snowing hard. It was about 15 degrees, dropping. She had a wool coat, a scarf, mittens, and winter boots, but the coat would not close properly over her belly at 8 months along. She had no blankets in the truck. She had groceries and iron pills. She had no way to call anybody, even if the phone line had been working at the house, which she had no way to know one way or the other. She sat for another few minutes, and then she felt the first contraction. She told me she thought at first it was just the baby moving, or maybe a false alarm, how women get sometimes in late pregnancy. She sat still and waited. The second contraction came about 8 minutes later. The third came 6 minutes after that. The third one made her grip the steering wheel. She got out of the truck. She had been thinking while she sat there. The truck was warmer than outside, but not by much. And if she stayed with it, she would freeze before anybody found her, because nobody was going to come looking for her in this kind of weather. And the mail carrier had already been through that morning. And my grandfather was 40 miles away and didn't even know she had left the house. The only chance she had was to walk. 1.5 miles to the house. She knew that lane like she knew her own kitchen. If she stayed on the track, she could not get lost, even in the whiteout. She started walking. She said the first half-mile was hard but possible. The contractions were coming, but they were spaced far enough apart that she could walk through the spaces between them. The snow was about a foot deep on the lane and still coming down, and the wind was picking up as the afternoon wore on into evening. She had left the truck around 4 in the afternoon. By 5, the light was failing. By 5:30, she could not see the sides of the lane anymore, only the faintest depression of the tire tracks she had made coming in, which were filling in almost as fast as she could follow them. And then the contractions got bad. She said she got about 3/4 of a mile from the truck before she could not walk anymore. She went down on her knees beside a cedar stump she had seen 100 times on that lane, a stump her husband had chopped 2 autumns back when the tree had come down in a windstorm, and she held onto that stump and she prayed, and she cried, and she felt the baby start to come. She had no idea what to do. She was 21 years old. She had never been in a room with a woman giving birth. The only thing she knew about childbirth was what she had read in a women's magazine at the Saranac Lake obstetrician's office 3 months earlier, and what her own mother had told her, which amounted to bring plenty of clean sheets and holler when you need the doctor. She did not have clean sheets. There was no doctor for 20 miles. She got her coat off. She got her scarf off. She spread the scarf on the snow next to the cedar stump because she thought, somewhere in the blur of pain and cold and terror, that the baby should not land on snow. She got her skirt and her slip and her stockings out of the way, and she pushed when her body told her to push, and she leaned against the cedar stump and screamed into the wind that was howling down that lane so hard it tore the scream out of her throat the second it left her mouth. My mother was born at 6:14 in the evening of February 3rd, 1956, on a scarf laid across new snow beside a cedar stump on the Tolbert Lane in Tupper Lake, New York. She came fast. My grandmother caught her with numb hands and wiped her face with the inside of her coat and bit through the cord the way she had heard somewhere you could do in an emergency. Though years later a nurse told her that was not the best method and she was lucky she had not caused an infection. She wrapped the baby inside her coat, against her skin, and she tried to stand up, and she could not stand up. She said her legs had nothing left in them. She said it was like the cord between her and the ground had been cut, along with the cord between her and the baby, and she had no power anymore to get herself upright. She sat with her back against the cedar stump and she held my mother inside her coat, and the snow was starting to cover her boots. And she knew, she told me, she knew with a certainty that was not even frightening at that point, that she was going to die on that lane, and the baby was going to die with her, and they were going to find the two of them in the spring when the snow melted. She closed her eyes. She said she was tired in a way she had never been tired before, a tired that went past the bones, into a place she had no name for. And she said she could hear the baby breathing inside her coat, fast little breaths, and she wanted to stay awake long enough to feel those breaths as long as they kept going. but she could not keep her eyes open. And then she smelled it. That was how she put it to me. She said, "I smelled something," and then she said what it was. It was not a smell she knew. It was heavy and earthy and a little sharp, like when you turn over leaf mold in the woods in October, but warmer and alive. It cut through the cold and the snow and the thin smell of blood on her coat, and she noticed it the way you notice a lamp being turned on in a room that has been dark a long time. Somebody had come close. She opened her eyes. Her voice cracked when she told me this part. 68 years later, with the end of her life a few hours off, her voice cracked. There was a shape standing about 15 feet from her in the snow. She could not see it clearly. The light was almost gone and the snow was thick and her eyes were unfocused from cold and exhaustion. But she could see that it was tall, taller than a man, broader, standing upright on two legs, perfectly still, looking at her. She said she was not afraid. She said she knew she should have been, but there was no fear left in her body by then. The fear had used itself up somewhere back on the lane during the walking, and what was left when the fear burned out was a clear nothing, a waiting. She looked at the shape and the shape looked at her, and neither of them moved. Then the shape came closer. It moved slow. It moved careful. It came to within about 6 feet of her, and it stopped again, and she could see it a little better now. The outline of it, the way it stood with its weight a little forward, the size of its head against the falling snow. It was covered in dark hair. She could see that much. The hair was mostly black, she told me, with gray running through it the way a wolf coat goes gray when the animal is old. She said she thought at first it was a bear standing up, but she knew that was not right, because bears do not stand like that, and bears do not smell like that, and bears do not have a face like the one that was looking at her out of the snow. It had a face. That was what she kept coming back to. A face and no muzzle, she said. The first thing she noticed after the size. Wide through the brow, heavy through the jaw, eyes set deep and dark, looking at her the way a person looks at another person. She told me she did not have a word for what was in that look, and she had stopped trying years ago to find one. She said she looked down at the baby inside her coat, and when she looked up again, the shape had come closer and was crouching in front of her in the snow, and its face was maybe 4 feet from her face. It made a sound, a low sound, almost below hearing, more of a vibration than a noise. She felt it in her chest before she heard it in her ears. It hummed for a few seconds and then stopped. Then it reached out one hand, a hand that was bigger than both of hers put together, with fingers that were long and thick and covered in the same dark hair, and it touched the edge of her coat where the baby was. Just touched it. A single fingertip laid against the wool, right where my mother's head was resting against my grandmother's chest. It held its finger there for maybe 4 seconds. Then it sat back on its heels. She said they looked at each other for a long time in the dark. She said she understood what it wanted without a word being passed between them. It was asking her a question, or offering her one. She was not sure which, but a question was being asked, and she was going to have to answer. She pulled the coat open a little, just enough that the baby could be seen. She said he made another sound when he saw her, a sound she could not have imitated if she had lived another 90 years. A long, soft note, almost sung, ending in a little rise at the end, like a greeting. He looked at my mother with an attention my grandmother said was the purest thing she had ever seen any living being direct at anything. The closest word she could come to was reverence, but that was not the whole of it. There was also what she could only call joy. Then he reached out both arms. She closed the coat. She said she surprised herself by doing it. Her body decided before her mind had time to weigh in. She pulled the coat tight around the baby, and she held on, and she looked at him in the snow, and she shook her head. She did not say anything. She just shook her head. He made the low humming sound again, longer this time. She said he was patient. She said he was not used to being patient. She could feel that. She could feel that he was accustomed to doing things on his own timing, but he was being patient with her because he understood she was not going to give up the baby no matter how long he waited. And he knew what she did not know, which was that she was running out of time. Then he did what she did not expect. He reached past her, slow, careful, never touching her skin, and he picked up her coat. Just the coat, not the baby. He lifted the edge of her coat, with her still inside it, and he made a gesture with his free hand that she could not possibly misunderstand. He pointed at her, at the snow around her, at the darkness closing in, and then he pointed up the lane in the direction of her house, and then he made a cradling motion with his arms. He was not asking her to give up the baby. He was asking her to let him carry both of them. She said the understanding came over her like a warm wave that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked at his face, at the eyes that were waiting for her answer, and she thought, I am going to die here if I do not do this, and so is my daughter, and this is the only help that is coming, and whatever he is not going to hurt us. Something in her knew that. It was not a hope. It was a certainty that had arrived without her permission, and that she could not have talked herself out of if she had tried. She nodded. He bent down. He put one enormous arm under her knees and the other behind her back, and he lifted her and the baby together as if she weighed nothing at all. She said she could feel the heat coming off his body like a stove. She said his chest against her shoulder was the warmest thing she had ever felt, and she could hear his heart, slow and heavy, through his ribs. He stood up holding her. He looked down at her face. She looked up at him. The snow was coming down between them, and the wind was screaming over the lane, and the light was almost entirely gone. And she closed her eyes and let her head rest against the hair of his shoulder. She did not remember most of the walk home. She said she drifted in and out. She remembered the motion of his stride, long and even and so smooth that the baby did not jostle against her chest. She remembered the sound of his breathing, deep and regular, like bellows. She remembered once opening her eyes and seeing the black mass of the spruce going past her on either side, too close, meaning he had left the lane and was walking through the timber, and she thought she should be afraid of that, but she was not, because he clearly knew where he was going. She remembered him stopping once, his head turning, his whole body going still around her, listening for a sound she could not hear. Then he started walking again, and she drifted off. The next thing she remembered clearly was being set down. She said she came awake as she was being lowered, gently, onto the wooden steps of the farmhouse porch. Her back was against the porch post. She was sitting up. He was crouched in front of her on the snow below the steps, his face once again about 4 feet from hers. The snow was still falling. The porch light, which she had left burning when she drove into town that morning, was on above her head, yellow and fuzzy through the flakes, and by its light she could see his face clearly for the first time. Her voice broke again when she told me this part. She took a long drink of water. I waited. She said his face was not a face she could describe to me in any way that would do justice to what she saw. In the yellow porch light, his eyes were amber brown, ringed with black. There was an old scar across the bridge of his nose, a pale V-shaped mark with the point running down toward the space between his eyes, as if something had once split the skin there in 2 diverging lines that had healed badly and set that way for good. His mouth was wide and closed, and the lips were dark, almost black. There was snow melting on his brow and running down the hair of his face like tears. He reached out with one finger. Slow, slow. He placed the tip of that finger on the edge of her coat, exactly where he had touched before, where my mother was. He held it there. Then he pulled his hand back. He stood up to his full height. He had to duck a little to stay below the overhang of the porch roof, and the porch roof was 8 feet off the ground. He looked at her one more time. He made that same long, soft note, the greeting note, the question that was not really a question. And then he turned and walked back down the steps, across the yard, across the meadow, and he was gone into the timber before she could even open her mouth to say thank you. She said she sat on that porch for a long time. She did not know how long. Her body was still warm from where his chest had been pressed against her, and the baby was still breathing inside her coat, and the snow was still falling, and she could not quite believe that any of it had happened. Eventually, she got herself up. She got into the house. She got the stove going. She wrapped my mother in clean flannel from the sewing basket and laid her in the cradle my grandfather had built 3 weeks earlier. She heated a kettle. She cleaned the baby. She lay down on the bed next to the cradle and listened to my mother breathing, and she cried until there were no tears left in her. The storm blew itself out around midnight. The phone line came back up sometime the next morning. She called Otis Tolbert and asked him to please drive up and help her get the truck out of the ditch, and could he stop at the house first, because she had some news. Otis came. He walked up on the porch, and my grandmother opened the door holding a 1-day-old baby girl wrapped in flannel. Otis was 68 and a widower, and he took one look at my grandmother and one look at the baby, and he sat down on the porch step and cried. He drove my grandmother and my mother to the General Hospital in Saranac Lake. The doctor there examined the baby and pronounced her healthy and of good weight, 7 pounds 2 ounces, which was a small miracle given the circumstances. He asked my grandmother how she had gotten from where the truck went off the road to her house in a blizzard in active labor. My grandmother told him she had walked. She told him she had made it inside the house and delivered the baby on the kitchen floor. She did not mention the cedar stump. She did not mention the scarf. She did not mention what came out of the snow. The doctor looked at her for a long moment, and then he wrote in her chart that she had walked and delivered it home, and he never asked her again. My grandfather came home 2 days later when they finally got word to him at the pulp camp. He held my mother and wept and said he would never leave them again for that long, and he kept that promise as much as a working man could. They went on to have 2 more children, my uncles Roland and Harvey, and they stayed in that farmhouse for another 42 years before they finally moved into the small place in town where my grandfather died in 2013. She never told him. My grandmother, in that hospice room, with her voice quiet and her eyes fixed on the ceiling, told me she had never told my grandfather, never once, in 57 years of marriage. Not on their anniversary, not when he was dying, not on any of the 1,000 ordinary evenings when they had sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the hemlocks. She said she had almost told him twice. Once, when my mother was a year old, and he had remarked, looking down into the cradle, that Delia had always seemed like an old soul to him, like she had seen things other babies had not seen. Once, when he was 63, and they had been out in the yard one summer evening, and he had said, out of nowhere, "Nora, do you ever feel like the woods are watching us?" She had almost told him then, but she did not, and she lived with that silence, she told me, like a limp that started so long ago you forget you ever walked any other way. She said she did not tell my mother either. She had tried, a few times, once when Delia was 16 and had asked why they had always had such a thing about the woods in February. Once when Delia was in her 30s and had brought up, over coffee, a story she had read in a magazine about a woman in Oregon who claimed she had seen a Bigfoot. My grandmother had opened her mouth both times and the words had gotten stuck behind her teeth, and she had swallowed them back down. By then, she told me, she had carried it for so long that it had become a part of her body, a thing like a liver or a spleen, and the thought of trying to get it out of her made her feel physically sick. My mother died in January of 2021. She had been in remission for 3 years, and then the cancer came back, and then she was gone. My grandmother was 86 years old at the funeral, and she stood at the graveside in the cold and she did not cry, and my uncles and I thought at the time that she was just being stoic. I know now she was thinking about the cedar stump. She was thinking about the moment the hand in the snow had reached out its arms and she had shaken her head. She was asking herself the question a mother should never have to ask, which is whether her love was enough. She told me all of this with her eyes closed. She told me that now that my mother was gone and my grandfather was gone, there was no one left to protect from the truth, and the truth belonged to whoever had the stomach to hear it, and she thought I had the stomach. I did have the stomach. I was not sure I had anything else, but I had the stomach. She slept for a while after that. The nurse came back in, checked her vitals, looked at me with the quiet, professional pity of someone who had seen this part 1,000 times, and went back out. I sat in the chair and tried to absorb what she had told me. I thought about Nora Haskell at 21, kneeling in the snow beside a cedar stump. I thought about my mother, Delia, whom I had loved more than anything, carried home through a blizzard in the arms of a thing she would never remember and never know to thank. I thought about the fact that my whole life had been downstream of that Carrie. No Carrie, no mother. No mother, no me. My grandmother woke once more. Around 2 in the morning, the nurse had stepped down the hall. My grandmother opened her eyes and looked at me and said, very clearly, "He never left, Stanley. That's the thing. He never left. He was still there when Delia was a little girl, and he was there when she had you, and he was there when your grandfather and I moved to town. I don't know if he's still there now, but you should go and see." I said, "Go where, Gram?" She said, "The Hollow, behind the old house. Otis's son sold the place to some people from Connecticut back in the 90s, and I don't know who has it now, but the Hollow is still the Hollow. Go in the spring, go when the snow's gone, and take something with you." I said, "Take what?" She said, "You'll know." She died at 5:10 that morning. The sky outside the window was still black, but in a different way than it had been earlier. The black the sky goes right before the first hint of a winter dawn. I held her hand until the nurse came. I signed the papers. I made the calls. I drove home at sunrise along Route 3 through Saranac Lake and Tupper Lake and on toward Childwold, past the turnoff to the Tolbert Lane, which I did not take. Not that morning, not yet. I was not ready. But I had her words in my head the whole way, and the Hollow was waiting, and I was going to have to go, and I knew it. The burial was in Tupper Lake, next to my grandfather, on a raw Tuesday at the end of October. 41 people came, which for a woman of 89 who had outlived most of her generation was a respectable turnout. The priest said, what priests say. We ate cold ham sandwiches in the church basement afterward. I drove home and sat in my kitchen and could not get warm. It took me 4 days to open the box of her things that my uncles and I had divided at the hospice. I had gotten the personal items, the correspondence, the rosary she had kept by her bed. The boys got the furniture. That was fair. I opened the box on a Friday night with the wood stove going and my dog asleep at my feet. I meant to sort. I meant to organize. I ended up holding the rosary for a long time, running the beads between my fingers the way I had watched her do 1,000 times when I was a boy, and thinking about her hands, which had always been small and weathered and capable, and were now folded on a satin liner in a pine box 6 feet under the ground outside Tupper Lake. The rosary came in a little leather pouch, soft brown leather, worn smooth, with a drawstring top. I had seen the pouch in her hands every Sunday of my life. I had never once looked inside it past the beads. There was a folded paper at the bottom of the pouch. I almost missed it. It had worked its way under the loop of chain at the crucifix end, and when I tipped the beads out onto the kitchen table to wipe them off, a small square of paper came with them, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. I unfolded it on the table. It was a page that had been torn from a steno pad, lined, about 4 inches square by the time it was opened flat. Both sides of the page were covered in my grandmother's small, tidy handwriting. Dates, just dates, each one with a single line beside it. The earliest entry at the top of the page said February 3rd, 1957. Beside it, in pencil, 1 year. He was at the treeline tonight. He knows. I had to sit down. I had been standing at the counter. The next entry said April 9th, 1957. He came to the edge of the meadow. Dahlia is walking now. He watched her through the kitchen window from about 40 yards out. I waved. He nodded and went back into the timber. Next entry, February 1958. Delia's second birthday. He left a flat stone on the porch step, about the size of my palm, river-worn, gray. I put it on the mantel. The entries went down both sides of the page, tiny and close together. Some years had one entry, some had 4 or 5. I counted. There were 41 separate entries, the earliest in 57, the latest dated June of 2022, 2 years before she died. She had kept this ledger in her rosary pouch for 67 years. She had said her prayers over it every morning and every night, folding it back into the leather with the beads at the end of each decade, and no one had ever known. One entry in the middle of the page made me stop. June 1978. Delia's wedding day at St. Alphonsus in Tupper Lake. He came out of the timber at the reception. He stood at the tree line for maybe a minute. Only I saw him. He watched her dance with her husband, and then he went back into the trees. Another entry, later, June of 2005. Stanley built a new porch. He was at Stanley's tree line too. I saw him from the yard when we were eating supper. No one else noticed. He follows her children, her children's children. He has not left us. The last entry, June 2022, was the shortest. He came to the meadow. I am old now. I think he knows. My hand started shaking while I read that last one. I folded the paper carefully along its old creases, and I put it back in the leather pouch with the beads. And I put the pouch on the shelf beside the photograph of my mother. I kept on the kitchen windowsill. I did not go outside that night. I went to bed. I lay awake until 3 in the morning thinking about 41 dates on a folded page in a rosary pouch. And what kind of woman carries a secret like that for 68 years and then hands it to her grandson in a hospice room on a Tuesday in October? And whether the one in the hollow, which I had grown up knowing nothing about, had known about me the whole time. I did not sleep much that winter. I made it through Thanksgiving and Christmas and a long, cold January that felt longer than any January I could remember. I thought about the hollow every day. I took the ledger out of the pouch and read it through every week. I did not go to the old Tolbert place, not yet, because I wanted to wait for spring as my grandmother had told me to, and because I was afraid, and I am not ashamed to say that now, though I was ashamed of it at the time. I was 45 years old, and I had pushed a snowplow through whiteouts at 3 in the morning alone on roads where other men had died. And I was afraid to drive 2 miles up a dirt lane in April to look at a piece of timber behind a house I had never set foot in. April came. The ground thawed. The snow pulled back in patches from the south sides of the spruce trees. By the last week of the month, the peepers were starting up in the bogs along Route 3, and the smelt were beginning their run up the bog river, and the mornings were starting to carry the thin green smell of willow bark coming to life. The plow season was over, and the highway department had me on light duty until the road patch crews got going in May. I took a Tuesday off. I packed a thermos of coffee and a sandwich and a walking stick, and I put one more thing in my pack that I had decided on during the long winter, and I drove east toward the turnoff for the Tolbert Lane. I did not know what I was going to find. I did not know if there would be anything there to find. What I could not have known until I got there was that the hollow had been waiting, and it had been keeping count, and it knew I was coming. The Tolbert Lane was not the Tolbert Lane anymore. The mailbox at the turnoff said Graves now, in faded vinyl letters, and the lane had been widened slightly and graveled over in the last decade. Though the grade was the same and the curves were the same, and the stretch where the spruce closed overhead was exactly where my grandmother had told me she had felt the truck start to slide. I drove up the lane slow, in low gear, my old Ford pickup creaking over the frost heaves. The house was still there. Someone had put vinyl siding on it in the 90s and built a new deck off the back, and the old outhouse was gone, and there was a satellite dish on the roof. where no satellite dish had ever been. But the footprint was the same. The meadow was the same. The tree line was the same. There was no car in the driveway. I had checked the tax records the week before and called the number listed, and a pleasant woman from Connecticut had told me her family only used the place in July and August, and she had no problem with me walking the property if I kept to the woods and did not disturb anything. I had told her I was a local man researching an old family story, which was true, and she had thanked me for asking politely and wished me luck. I parked at the end of the drive. I got out. Jigger was in the passenger seat and he wanted to come, but I left him. I did not know what I was walking into, and I did not want the dog involved. The first thing I did was walk to the cedar stump. I knew where it would be. My grandmother had described the location well enough that I could have found it in my sleep. 3/4 of the way down the lane from the house, on the right-hand side, just before the lane bent, left around a stand of young fir. I walked it off. I counted steps. I stopped where the stump should have been. It was still there. Not the stump exactly, because 69 years had passed, and wood does not last that long in the Adirondack weather. But the depression where the stump had been, a low mound of softer ground covered in moss and partridge berry, ringed by a circle of ferns that had not yet unfurled from their spring coils. The shape of it was still readable. I put my hand on the moss. The ground was cold. I stood there for a long time. I did not cry. I thought I might, but I did not. What I felt was quieter than crying. My grandmother had been 21 years old, and alone, and dying on this ground. My mother had been 1 minute old and taking her first breath on this ground. A living being had come out of the woods and decided they were both going to live on this ground. Whatever I had come to find, I had already found the important part. The place was real. It was under my boots. I sat down beside the old stump. I took my pack off. I took out the thing I had brought. My grandmother had said, "Take something with you." And she had said, "You'll know." I had spent 4 months trying to figure out what she meant. I had thought about bringing food. I had thought about bringing a photograph. I had thought about bringing flowers, which felt foolish, or a prayer, which felt more foolish. And then one afternoon in late March, I had been cleaning out a trunk of my mother's that had been stored in my garage since her death, and I had found a wool scarf. It was her scarf. I had recognized it immediately. My mother had worn it every winter for as long as I could remember, a soft red wool scarf with a gray stripe at the ends, and when she had gotten sick, she had asked me to put it away in the trunk for safekeeping, because she said it smelled like her and she wanted it kept out of the weather. I had not opened the trunk in the 4 years since she died. I had held it up in my garage. I had put my face in it. It still smelled, faintly, like my mother, like the perfume she had worn since the 80s, and underneath that, like her. I had known, then, what to bring. I took the scarf out of my pack. I laid it across the mossy depression where the cedar stump had been. I smoothed it flat. I said, out loud, because it seemed like the thing to do, "This belonged to Delia. Her mother carried her home from here a long time ago." The woods did not answer. I had not expected them to. I sat for a while longer. Then I got up and I walked the tree line. I walked the edge of the meadow where my grandmother said he had crossed when he left that night. The meadow had grown in some since 1956, but the hollow beyond was still clear enough to see. A long fold in the land where the ground dropped away toward a creek I could hear but not see, and rose again on the far side into old timber. Old timber of a sort you don't see much anymore in the northern Adirondacks, because the pulp companies took most of it in the 40s and 50s. This patch had been missed somehow, protected, maybe by topography, or by the old man Tolbert's refusal to sell the timber rights, or by whoever lives in it and does not want it cut. I walked along the edge of the meadow into the first of the old spruce. The smell changed the moment I stepped into the shade. It got darker and greener and a little wet, the way old forests smell even in April when the snow is mostly gone. The moss underfoot was deep and springy. There were fallen trees covered in lichen that had probably been down since before I was born. I walked for maybe 15 minutes. I was not going anywhere in particular. I was letting the ground decide. The hollow got deeper as I went. The creek came into view, narrow and black, running clear over stones. I crossed it on a log that had fallen across at a good place. On the far side I stopped. There was a tree. It was a hemlock, old, maybe 3 feet through at the base. Someone had been leaning against it. The bark on one side, from about 6 feet up to about 8 feet up, was rubbed smooth, not by deer. A deer rub is narrower and lower and rougher, and this was not that. This was the mark of someone tall who had leaned his shoulder against the tree, many times, over many years, in exactly the same spot. I stood and looked at it. I ran my hand over the smooth bark. It was warm from the sun. Around the base of the tree, in a loose arrangement I almost missed at first, there were stones. They were not a pile. They were a ring, maybe 20 stones, none of them larger than a fist. All of them gathered from the creek bed, judging by their smooth, water-worn surfaces, and laid in a rough circle about 4 feet across at the foot of the hemlock. The circle was clean, no leaf litter in it, nothing growing through it. Someone had kept it clear. I did not touch the stones. I backed away from the tree. I was shaking a little by then. I walked back across the creek and up through the old timber toward the meadow. I was most of the way back to the tree line when I stopped again. Somebody was watching me. I did not see it. I did not hear it. I felt it, the way you feel it when a deer is close in the brush and you have not spotted it yet. That pressure on the edge of your attention that is older than language and operates below the level of thought. I stopped walking. I stood very still. I did not turn my head. I said, out loud, to the air, I came to say thank you. Nothing moved. The pressure did not go away. It stayed on me for maybe 20 seconds, and then it eased, slow, the way a hand is slowly lifted off your shoulder, and I knew I was alone again. I walked back to the cedar stump. The scarf was still where I had left it. I picked it up and folded it and put it in my pack. I walked back to the truck. Jigger was sleeping. I started the engine. I sat for a minute before I backed out of the drive, looking at the tree line one more time, and then I drove home. I did not go back right away. I needed to think. I went back 3 weeks later, on a warmer Saturday in May, with better light and a better plan. I brought the scarf again. I brought a small thermos of maple syrup because I had thought about it a lot and decided that if I were going to leave something edible, it ought to be of this place. A gift that came out of the same sugar bush maples that grew up on the ridges all around the hollow. Maple is the oldest offering this country has. The Mohawk were cooking down maple sap on these ridges 1,000 years before my grandfather's grandfather set foot in the county. I walked out to the hemlock with the stones. The stones were still there. The circle was still clean, but there was a gift new on the moss inside the circle. A gift that had not been there 3 weeks earlier. A feather. It was a turkey feather, long, about a foot. A primary wing feather that a big tom sheds in spring. It was laid in the exact center of the stone circle, pointing away from the tree, toward the creek. Someone had placed it there. I stood and looked at it for a long time. I set the scarf down at the edge of the circle, outside the stones. I opened the thermos of maple syrup and poured a little, maybe 2 tablespoons worth, onto a flat piece of birch bark I had brought for the purpose, and I set the bark beside the scarf. I stepped back. I said, I don't know if you understand me. I don't know if you knew her, but she was my mother, and you carried her home when she was 1 minute old, and I am her son, and I came to thank you. I did not wait for a response. I walked back toward the tree line. I was halfway across the meadow when the sound came. It was one long, low note, held for maybe 4 seconds, coming from the old timber on the far side of the hollow. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. You felt it in your breastbone before you heard it in your ears. My grandmother had tried to tell me what that sound was like, back in the hospice, and had given up. I understood now. There was no telling it. You had to hear it. I stopped walking. I stood in the meadow in the late afternoon sun with the grass knee-high around me, and I listened to the note hold and then taper off into silence. I did not turn around. I did not need to turn around. Whoever had made the sound was not asking me to approach. He was telling me he had heard me. That was all. I got in the truck and drove home and sat on my own porch that night until well after dark, and I did not speak a word. And Jigger lay against my boot and seemed to understand that nothing needed to be said. I went back in June and July and again in August. Each time I brought a small gift, a handful of blueberries from my own patch, a piece of hard cheese, a pine cone from a white pine that grew behind my house, the only mature white pine in my yard, because it seemed like a gesture that meant something to both of us. Each time the gift was gone when I came back the next visit. Each time an offering had been left in return on the stone circle, a curl of birch bark, a small, smooth river stone that was warm to the touch when I first picked it up, though it had been sitting on cold ground, a tuft of gray-black hair that I put carefully into a glass jar and kept on a shelf in my den, because I wanted proof that I was not losing my mind, and because I felt that someday I might need to show it to someone. In July, I brought my grandmother's rosary. I had been carrying it in my pocket since her funeral, and it had occurred to me that she might have wanted it in that hollow, since the hollow was where the most important event of her life had happened. I did not leave the rosary. I did not think the one in the timber had any use for a string of beads from a Catholic woman dead since the fall, and it felt like the wrong kind of gift. A gift that belonged to a different kind of God than whatever walked those ridges. But I took it with me, and I sat with it at the hemlock, and I said the prayers my grandmother had taught me when I was a boy. I said them out loud. Hail Mary, full of grace. I said them in the slow cadence she used to say them, the cadence of a woman who had said those words 10,000 times and never once gotten bored of them. When I was done, I put the rosary back in my pocket, and I had the distinct sense that my grandmother had been heard, wherever she was, by whoever was listening, and that was enough. Around the 4th of July, a thing happened that I did not expect. I told someone, or I almost did. It was Uncle Roland, my grandmother's oldest boy, 67 now, the one she had after my mother. He came up to my place for 4th of July week, as he always did. He had retired from the railroad 2 years back. His wife Doris had passed the year before that, and he spent most of his summers driving around the North Country in a camper visiting places where he used to know people. He parked the camper in my side yard and stayed 4 days. We grilled on the porch. We drove into town and got ice cream at Miller's. We sat up late the second night drinking the bourbon he had brought, and he started telling me things about my grandmother that I had never heard. Small things. How she used to sing while she hung laundry. How she always set aside the crust of her toast for the birds. How she never once in her life missed a Sunday Mass until the last year when she could not get out of bed. And then he said, out of nowhere, she had a secret she was not telling us. I did not react. I kept my face still. I sipped the bourbon. He said, your mother said it to me once, not long before she got sick the second time. She said, Roland, Ma has been holding on to a thing her whole life. I do not know what it is, but it is there. I can feel it every time she looks at me. I could have told him. The bourbon was in me, and the porch was warm, and the frogs were loud in the wet hollow behind my woodshed, and it was the moment my grandmother had meant when she said I had the stomach. I could have told Uncle Roland what the secret was. I could have unloaded it onto him, a 67-year-old widower drinking with his nephew on a July night. I did not. I sat there with my mouth shut and the blood up in my ears and the bourbon starting to burn a little in my stomach, and I understood for the first time what my grandmother had understood for 68 years. which was that there is no right moment to give a secret like this away. There is only the moment when it is yours to hold, and the moment when it is yours to hand to the next person, and those moments are not the same, and the distance between them is sometimes a lifetime. I said, I think Ma had her share of things that were hers. I think that is all right. Uncle Roland looked at me for a long moment. I thought he might push. He did not. He said, yes, I suppose you are right. He drank off the last of his bourbon. He said, she was a good one, Stanley. She was a good one. I said, she was. We went to bed a while after that. He drove out the next morning with his camper. I watched him go and I felt something lift off my chest that I had not realized was sitting on it, which was the fear that I was going to fail the trust. I was not going to fail. I was going to carry this as she had carried it, and I was going to find the right one to hand it to when the time came, and I was going to know that person when I met them, and until I did. The story was mine, and the hollow was mine, and the one in the timber was mine, as much as any of those things can belong to any person. August was hot and dry. The fire danger in Franklin County went to extreme for 10 days in the middle of the month, and I did not drive up to the hollow during that stretch because I did not want to risk a spark from the truck exhaust on dry grass. When I finally got up there on the 21st, the creek was down further than I had ever seen it, further than the woman from Connecticut had described it when I had called to ask her about the property. The black water that had run over stones all spring and summer was a trickle now, and on either side of that trickle there were long flats of gray creek clay, exposed for the first time since the previous summer, drying out in the heat but still soft where the last of the water had left. In the clay, about 6 feet from the hemlock with the stones, was a handprint. It was pressed into the clay palm down, the way you would press your hand into wet cement to leave a mark. The fingers were long and thick. The palm was broad. The thumb was set lower on the hand than a human thumb sits, and at a different angle. It was the hand my grandmother had described to me in the hospice room, the hand that had lifted her out of the snow in 1956. Its span from the tip of the middle finger to the base of the palm was just under 14 inches. I measured it with the tape on my folding knife, because I was shaking too hard to trust my memory of the number. It had been placed there on purpose. That was what I kept coming back to. A hand going about its business does not press itself, palm down, into soft clay, and then lift cleanly away, leaving a shape that could be measured. This was a mark that had been set, the same way my grandmother had laid a scarf on the snow so her daughter would not land on it, the same way I had laid my mother's scarf on the moss at the cedar stump, a hand placing something on the ground so another hand later would find it. I sat on the bank of the creek for a long time looking at that handprint. I did not touch it. I did not photograph it, though I had my phone in my pocket. Photographing it would have made it evidence, and I did not want it to be evidence. I wanted it to be what it was, a hand laid on the clay, so that if I came looking, I would see it and know. Eventually I got up. I walked to the hemlock. The stones were the same as they had been. No new offering had been left on the moss inside the circle. The handprint on the creek bank was the whole of the communication that day. I walked back up through the old timber toward the meadow. I stopped once, halfway up, and I said out loud, I saw it. Thank you. The woods did not answer. They did not need to. By the time I reached the truck, the light had gone hard and yellow, the way it goes in the Adirondacks in the late afternoon of a dry August. And I sat in the cab with the door open and I cried again, because the hand that had saved my grandmother had pressed itself into mud for me to find, and there is nothing in this world I will ever be able to do that is equal to that. I never saw him in person that summer, not once across the 3 months, but I felt him every time I went in, a pressure at the edge of my attention. The sense of being watched by somebody who was not a stranger and was not angry and was not going anywhere. In late August, I took Jigger with me for the first time. He was 16 years old and mostly blind in one eye, and I figured if there was ever a time for him to meet the one who had saved my mother, it was before his own time was up. He rode across the meadow on his old stiff legs beside me, panting, stopping to sniff things. I expected him to bristle when we got close to the hollow, the way dogs are supposed to bristle when something not right is near. He did not. He walked to the base of the hemlock. He lay down. He put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. In the middle of the woods, in a place where a dog should have been nervous, he fell into the deepest sleep I had seen him have in a year. I sat beside him for an hour. When I got up to go home, he woke slowly and looked at me with an expression that I swear to God was contentment, and we walked out together. I did not see him until September. It was a cool Saturday morning, the air sharp for the first time since April, and I had driven up early with a thermos of coffee. The sun was still low and the meadow was bright with dew. I was standing at the edge of the old timber, drinking my coffee, not intending to walk in yet, just standing there, enjoying the light. He stepped out of the tree line on the far side of the meadow. He did not try to hide. He did not emerge by degrees. He stepped out into the open grass in full morning sun, as if he had been waiting for me to be in the right place for this to happen. He was tall, taller than I had let myself believe, even with my grandmother's description in my head for almost a year. 7.5 feet at least. Broad through the shoulders so that my own shoulders, which are not small, felt like a boy's shoulders by comparison. Covered in dark hair, mostly black, with gray running through it in streaks at the shoulders and along the lower jaw, more gray than my grandmother had described. I understood right away that I was looking at an older version of the same being, older by 69 years. His face, I have thought about how to describe his face for a long time, and I have decided that I cannot do better than my grandmother did. He had a face, wide at the brow, heavy through the jaw, with eyes that were amber brown in the morning sun, and across the bridge of his nose, a pale V-shaped scar, clear as a mark made yesterday, the point running down toward the space between his eyes. The scar. My grandmother had told me about the scar, a pale V, splitting the bridge of the nose. Something had once opened the skin there, so deep it had healed into that exact shape and had stayed for good. I could see the scar clearly from 120 feet away in the morning light. It was the same one, the one who had crouched in the snow on a blizzard evening in 1956 and touched a fingertip to my grandmother's coat to ask if the baby was all right, that was now standing in a sunlit meadow 69 years later, looking at me across the grass. I have done a lot of work in my life that required me to hold myself together when my body did not want to be held together. This was worse than any of that. There was a pulse going in my throat so hard I could feel it in my jaw. My hands were shaking around the coffee thermos. Tears came up before I could decide whether I was going to let them. I did not move. I did not want to do anything he could read as threat or retreat. He stayed at the tree line across the meadow. He did not come closer. He was giving me time. I set the thermos down on the grass. Slow. I straightened up. I said, "Hello." My voice sounded thin to me, like a boy's voice, like the voice of someone much younger than 45. I said, "I'm Stanley, Delia's boy, Nora's grandson." I do not know if he understood the words. I do not know if he knew the names. But the set of his mouth changed when I said my mother's name. A small shift, the angle of the head dropping just slightly, and I felt, the way you feel these things in your chest rather than your mind, that he had understood the name Delia. He had understood who I meant. He made a sound. Not the long-held note from the other visits. A shorter sound, lower, with a lift at the end. A sound a man makes when he has been waiting to say something for a long time and finally gets to say it. My throat closed. I could not have spoken if I had wanted to. He raised one hand, just raised it, open-palmed, to about the height of his shoulder, and then he lowered the hand. I raised mine. We stood there for a long moment. two old men on opposite sides of a meadow, one of us human and one of us not, each of us taking the measure of the other. Then he turned, slow, and he walked back into the tree line. The grass closed behind him, the shadows took him, and he was gone. I sat down on the wet grass. I do not remember deciding to sit. My legs stopped holding me up. I sat there in the dew with the thermos tipped over next to me and the coffee running into the grass, and I cried. I drove home that afternoon. I went into my house. I took my mother's scarf out of the bottom drawer of my dresser, where I had put it after the May visit, and I held it to my face for a long time. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about my mother. I thought about him across the meadow, raising his hand. I thought about the scar on his face, which meant that long before he had ever seen my grandmother in the snow, a violence had happened to him, and he had survived, and he had kept walking the hollow, and eventually he had found a woman in labor beside a cedar stump, and he had chosen to save her. That choice had made me possible. Every breath I have ever drawn has been downstream of it. Every dog I have loved, every plow I have pushed through a January whiteout, every dawn I have watched come up over the raquette, all of it exists because he crouched in the snow and decided that a 21-year-old girl and her 1-minute-old daughter were going to live. I went back twice more that fall. Both times I left a gift at the hemlock, and both times an offering was left in return. In October, I brought a last few apples from the tree in my yard. The old russet my grandmother had given me, a scion of the year I bought the house, taken off her own tree, which she had grown from a scion off her father's tree the year she got married. When I came back a week later, the apples were gone, and there was, on the flat stone in the middle of the circle, a single feather from what I think was a great horned owl, laid crosswise over a curl of white birch bark. I put the feather and the bark in the same glass jar as the hair. The last visit was in early November, the week before the first hard snow. I did not see him again. I did not expect to. I left a small loaf of molasses bread, the recipe of which had come down through my grandmother from her own mother, and I sat at the edge of the meadow until the light got low and the wind shifted cold off the ridge to the north, and I went home. The snow came that night. It stayed, the way it does up here. I have not been back since. I have decided, for this winter at least, to stay out of the hollow. The ground where the cedar stump used to be will be buried under 4 feet of snow by January, and I do not want to disturb what happened there. Come spring, I will go back. I will bring my mother's scarf again. I will sit for a while. I will leave what seems right to leave. I do not know how many more springs the one with the scar has left. If he has the lifespan my grandmother guessed he had, and I do not know how many I have myself, but I know that the hollow will outlast both of us, and that someone will keep walking it after we are both gone, and that is a comfort I did not expect to find. I have thought a lot about why my grandmother told me. I have thought about why she waited. I have thought about whether she made the right choice carrying it alone all those years, not telling my grandfather, not telling my mother. I used to think, in the first months after she died, that she had been selfish, that she had denied my mother a piece of her own origin story. That Delia should have known, all her life, that somebody had come out of the snow for her on the night she was born, because knowing that would have changed the shape of her life for the better. I do not think that anymore. I think my grandmother understood a thing it took me a year to understand. The story was not hers to give to my mother. The story belonged to the one in the hollow. My grandmother was a witness, and she had been handed the story as a trust, and she had carried that trust for 68 years because nobody else had come along yet who could carry it with her. When she handed it to me, it was not because she had decided my mother didn't deserve it. It was because she had decided I was the next one who could hold it. I am going to hold it. Back to the hollow as long as my knees let me. When my knees stop letting me, I will sit at my kitchen window in Cranberry Lake and look east toward where the hollow is, and I will remember. I have recorded the story the way my grandmother told it to me. And the recording is not to be played until I am gone. The arrangements are made. The letters are written. The hair sits in a jar on a shelf in my den, with the feather and the birch bark and a small smooth stone from the creek. The photograph of the scarred face I never took, but I will carry it in my head until the last time my head carries anything. At the very end, before she slept and did not wake again, she said it again. She said, "He never left, Stanley. He never left." She meant the hollow. She meant the one in the timber behind her house, who had kept watch over her family for 68 years, not because she had asked him to, not because she had earned it, but because on one February evening in a blizzard, he had made a choice to carry a newborn baby home through the snow, and he had decided in that carrying that the carrying would not end. She was right. He never left. I have sat in the meadow at dusk and felt him watching. I have walked the edge of the hollow on a July morning and heard a low note hum from the old timber like a man humming under his breath while he worked. Feathers laid in rings of stones. Gifts taken, offerings left in return. One September morning I looked across a meadow into amber eyes and raised a hand was raised back. My mother never knew. She went her whole life without knowing. She died without knowing. I have stopped grieving that, because I have come to believe she did know, in some part of herself that did not have words for it. She loved the woods like nothing in her life had taught her to. She would lower the car window at night when we were driving home and listen to the trees. She would sit on the porch of the house I grew up in on summer evenings, staring out at the tree line, and I remember her doing that more times than I can count. Some part of her was watching the tree line the way my grandmother had watched it for 68 years, even if she never had a word for what she was watching for. The scarf is on my dresser. The jar is on the shelf. The hollow is 15 miles east of me, waiting through the winter. In the spring I will go, and in the meantime, I will sit by my own wood stove with Jigger at my feet, and I will think about my grandmother at 21 in the snow, and the hand that lifted her, and the face with the pale V-scar across the nose, and my mother at 1 minute old, wrapped in a wool coat against the chest of a being with no name, being carried home through a blizzard. My grandmother was not wrong to keep it. I am not wrong to tell it. If you find yourself someday at the edge of an old piece of timber at dusk, and the air goes still, and you feel eyes on you that you cannot see, do not be afraid. Stand where you are. Say the name of someone you love. There is more kindness in those woods than the world has been willing to believe.